to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with another week of World War III analysis. This is episode 81. We're going to discuss all things going on in the breaking news, everybody. I don't know what part of the podcast you're listening to when we're going to insert this in. This is a breaking news update. We're recording this after the main recording. Of course, you probably already know what this is about. It's about the assassination attempt on President Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. He was at a big rally and a bullet grazed his ear. Secret Service surrounded him. They discovered there was a shooter on a roof about 152 yards away or something like that. He was taken out by Secret Service. This is a huge, enormous breaking story. This is the most major attempted assassination on a president since, I don't know, Ronald Reagan, I guess, or something like that. This is huge news. It's horrible news for Biden. I mean, the iconic images already coming out of this will probably have one of them in the thumbnail. It's crazy. Obviously, there's so much that we need to talk about. The name of the shooter is still somewhat up in the air. I'm sure by the time you're listening to this, it will probably be known. So there's so many things going on. We're going to try to make this a quick, concise update to get this into the weekly World War III analysis. Dimitri, what are you thinking right now?
Yeah, look, it's incredible. It was very scary seeing Donald Trump, of course, being hit by a bullet, grazing his ear, and literally by only the grace of God and by the intervention of, I suppose, all the collective prayers, right? We all Orthodox Christians, and I think all Christians around America, various denominations, are praying for the president and the American government to make the right decisions, to stay in the right lane, make the right connections. And what we saw here was, of course, Donald Trump turning his head to the right, just to make a certain remark about Joseph Biden and about some of his results over the last 4 years. And the shooter choosing that exact moment, shooting the bullet, it grazes the ear, hits an unfortunate bystander in the crowd sitting down, one of the Trump supporters, kills him. And of course, the name of the deceased person still hasn't been released, but Donald Trump has already sent his condolences. Trump, of course, gets brought down by his Secret Service officers, and of course, the shooter is quickly taken out. Allegedly, he was shooting from the rooftop of one of the nearby buildings, only 130 meters, about I think 150 yards away. So it wasn't even that far, Conrad. Roughly, 1.5 football fields away. It really wasn't very far. And frankly, judging by the results and judging by the fact that Trump only turned his head by sheer, or you can say by almost accident, by providence, this bullet was meant to hit Trump in the head and essentially assassinate him amidst the public rally, amidst the speech, and essentially demoralize the entire American population, potentially, as a lot of political commentators and spokespersons are saying, this would have potentially escalated into maybe even an American civil war, which frankly the elites have been pushing, of all this Hollywood propaganda, the mainstream media, as well as the agitation of the left, the Antifa, pointing them towards, aiming them at conservatives, at MAGA supporters, at Christians, claiming that they're the enemy, and likewise, of course, amongst their own ranks, ramping up the degeneracy in order to, I suppose, agitate the entire American population. And seeing the president, getting killed on public television like that, on live, would have, of course, completely demoralized and probably shattered the American conscience. So it was quite horrific, and we were only moments away from that, and Trump was saved. But I think there's severe consequences that will come from this, especially, and some really deep considerations that hopefully Trump will walk away with in terms of who is around him, who is protecting him, because somebody greenlit this particular event. I think there's a chance that this was a lone gunman patsy, like some left-wing Antifa nutcase, like we did see some footage, and, there was, of course, photographs released of the killer from the rooftop. He was quickly taken out by Secret Service officers, and he does look like a Caucasian white fellow with long hair, looks a bit strange, like a typical Antifa creep. Right, someone from Reddit, perhaps, and I think it'll come out eventually, Conrad, exactly as to who was behind this, or perhaps it'll never come out, and this will be just one of those conspiracies that will keep us guessing for years to come.
Well, yeah, again, there's so much we don't know right now, but we do know a lot. And one thing we know is that there is another person who's deceased in the midst of the shooting and two others actually in critical condition. So keep those people in your prayers. Obviously, President Trump is in the spotlight, but somebody is dead. A Trump supporter was an ER doctor. He was the first to get to that person that got shot in the head by the sniper, and he didn't make it. He said he saw his brains splattered all over the stage. So it's a very unfortunate situation. The fact that Secret Service didn't have this rooftop covered, again, very, very strange. Obviously, a lot of people are going with the this was staged thing. I'm not 100% convinced of that yet. And, I love conspiracy theories, and I'm really into the whole alchemical transmutation, ritual, playing things out, crisis actors. I'm all about it. But I'm not 100% convinced on this yet. And we have a report as well. Apparently, Secret Service Director Kim Cheadle has repeatedly turned down requests for a larger security footprint around President Trump in recent months, and Republicans in Congress are going to start calling for her resignation. That makes a lot of sense. Obviously, I'm not sure if this was some kind of internal coup. There's levels to the way it could be staged or the conspiracy. I don't know if anybody actually was interested in taking out President Trump. Again, it seems to me like it's most likely that some deranged Redditor had been whipped up into a frenzy about supposed anti-LGBT, anti-abortion stuff about Republicans and felt the need to take matters into his own hands. But there's also a likelihood that the deep state realized that Biden was literally going to lose no matter what, and so they needed to take out Trump to get in some kind of Republican patsy, because if this had worked, it all would have been over. Some Republican normie establishment person would have gotten in, and we would have been back to business as usual in American politics, as if Jeb Bush or something had won in 2016. So very interesting developments, to say the least. The photos, there's literally a photo of a bullet like grazing, either it's about to hit him or it has just literally moments, seconds, milliseconds before hit his ear. And the fact that it just grazed his ear like that is crazy. I don't know if me and Dimitri are going to get into any of this Purim type, ear ritual like we did with the Crocus City Hall thing. I don't know if there's some kind of connection here, but yeah, this is all very crazy. Again, we saw Biden send condolences to Trump, George W. Bush say that he's glad to see that Trump is safe, all the former presidents coming out. Again, we know that this has basically secured Trump his victory if he doesn't, get assassinated for real in the next few months before the election. But quite the development indeed, Dimitri. I know Viktor Orban was recently around Trump as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are really they begin speaking about American domestic policy, which does matter so much, especially because this will be the next American president, and sort of his policies will determine the future of the country. But in terms of foreign policy, there's a lot of weight on Trump's decisions, especially in Europe and Eastern Europe, calling for Zelensky. And there's a lot of people in Europe, a lot of people in NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who we spoke about in the episode. There's a lot of NATO officials who really need that American funding. They need the war in Ukraine to continue. They need for the military-industrial complex of these various nations, including America itself, to keep churning out weapons, giving them to Ukraine, promoting sales, etc. So the fraud, the circus can continue. And of course, Russians and Slavic Orthodox Christians can keep dying and killing themselves, right? So there's this large consideration. And suddenly Donald Trump, he's already called for peace, and he's actually spoken openly that he's like, okay, I can arrange a deal between Zelensky and Putin. And you have Viktor Orban, Conrad, traveling in this last just 7 days. And this is key. In the last 7 days, Viktor Orban has traveled to Kiev. He's met with Zelensky. They've had an open sort of interview, but notice how quiet he's been around Zelensky. In private, perhaps, as we've said before in the episode, I think they've discussed something a lot more serious behind closed doors. There's no paperwork. And then Viktor Orban, of course, travels to Moscow, again speaks to Putin, but in a very somber tone. Look at Viktor Orban's face. He's very quiet, somber, sober, speaks to Putin probably behind closed doors, and then instantly goes back to Florida. And in Florida, he meets Donald Trump at his place at Mar-a-Lago just yesterday. And today, of course, the assassination attempt takes place. And you're probably listening to this a few days later, but this connection, I think, cannot be ignored. The peace in Ukraine is a deal which is looming large on Trump's agenda going into this next presidency. And it didn't suit somebody. I'm not sure who. I mean, there's a lot of beneficiaries to this. There's a lot of people who would have benefited from Donald Trump's death. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't necessarily come to any quick conclusions that perhaps it could have been a completely deranged person. We have to consider the range of the sniper fire, Conrad. It was only about 140, 150 meters at most, which, if this guy was practicing at a firing range for some years, definitely he could have potentially made that shot. And it's just quite horrific. And I think by the grace of God, we all will be praying for our government this Sunday. And this is essentially the times we pray for, so that our countries are saved from civil war, from internal strife, which, by the way, the elites, sometimes they do have these options. They will activate internal civil wars and conflict inside of the country through events such as this, like the head of a president being blown up on camera live in order to agitate and demoralize the population. So I think we were all saved, and the civil war was pushed back perhaps by a year or two, or maybe a few years if we're lucky.
Again, the potential for a civil war, I've always said, is low, but this is one of those few events that might actually may be able to make something akin to, mass factional unrest actually occur on the soil of the United States. So it's really insane that this is going on. I know I keep saying that, but that's kind of the energy right now. Be sure to keep Donald Trump in your prayers. Keep the other people in Pennsylvania that have been killed or injured in your prayers, and their families. I believe there's a GoFundMe that the Trump campaign has shared. There's rumors that there's a few different names going around on who the shooter is. Again, probably not going to say any of them right now because they're not confirmed. I'm sure by the time you're listening to this, you will know who it is, maybe get a bit more of their background. Again, our prediction here seems to be some kind of leftist figure, again, probably with a Reddit account. But I don't know if they're going to work to scrub that from the internet or anything else. But Yeah, I mean, Trump, his ear seems intact as well. It's not like his ear got blown off even. It seems like a very slight graze. But unless you have anything else to say on this event, Dimitri, obviously this is going to be forthcoming. Follow us on the social medias and continue enjoying the episode. It's still some good analysis. I also have my recent Cyprus article is out, so it'll be linked below. But I'd love your final thoughts on this, Dimitri.
Yeah, I think the American people were saved by a mere accident, by God's intervention, and I think a lot of the people are coming to the same conclusions that Donald Trump will inevitably, due to this action, Conrad, unless Donald Trump is assassinated, via another attempt on his life, the mainstream media definitely isn't taking this seriously. You can see them calling it just an incident, a shooting at a rally. Whereas in reality, it was a literal assassination attempt, JFK style, right? Like it was like there was one in the 1960s, and even the attempt on Ronald Reagan's life, and all the other assassination attempts throughout American history, right? There were so many. This was another one, and you can see the mainstream media not taking it seriously, as per usual, trying to gaslight and control the narrative. Very disgusting, I think. And we're all very serious listeners and viewers, and we actually have to take this news, I think, quite seriously. Need to pray for Donald J. Trump, pray for America, pray for peace, and I think that's the main news sort of going into this week, frankly, because this story, I don't think anything really can, no pun intended, trump this particular event.
European Eastern fronts, the things going on in the Pacific, the big NATO summit that recently happened. We had Biden introducing the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin himself. So a lot of gaffes, a lot of interesting geopolitical foreign policy developments. We're, of course, also going to talk about the things going on in the Holy Land, strikes from Hezbollah, actually Hezbollah-related Greek Orthodox missile squads striking Israel. Interesting developments there. Of course, things going on in Cyprus, things going on in the Caucasus. We're going to be talking about some developments in the church, new canonizations in the Romanian Orthodox Church, 16, some amazing saints, Elder Cleopa, Dimitri Staniloy, some of these names that many of you will know. So we're going to cover all of that, a lot more, Africa, other things going on. So big week. Of course, I've got some articles coming out finally, trying to make that a weekly thing now that I'm leaning more into World War now. Here, Dimitri's got some works coming along as well. And of course, we've got big guests. But Dimitri, it's been a pretty big week in World War III. How are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. Yes, there's been a lot of developments this week, and I think one of the largest stories that's worth discussing is the 2024 NATO Washington summit, which you already mentioned. And we do all know all the famous Joe Biden clips where he's come out, made some serious gaffes, but there was a very interesting 10 to 15 minute segment where Biden actually made no verbal mistakes, very interestingly, when he did speak about the Palestine-Israel issue. And he spoke about how the US really needs to maintain a certain, peacekeeping humanitarian neutrality between the countries. So when he spoke about Netanyahu and Israel, he didn't name Netanyahu directly, but he did say the US had trouble, and he said that his administration personally failed to quell some of the concerns regarding, the use of armaments on Palestinian civilians and things like that. So he said basically he admitted that he wasn't in control in the whole Israeli-Palestinian issue, which I think we would agree with Joseph Biden on that, because frankly, we know who's really in control. It's definitely not Joe Biden. Joe Biden has no say over Israel, frankly. He definitely should. The president of the US, given all the billions of dollars of American taxpayer money and fiat currency pumped out and literally printed, inflating the American dollar, wrecking the US economy, being donated to Israel, it should have a say in terms of what Israel does in its foreign policy as well as even domestic policy, because what's happening at home in Palestine and Gaza, the West Bank, is definitely should be of interest to the US. But in fact, unfortunately, we have seen these AIPAC handlers really hold the reins, and Joe Biden is this nagging horse, or shall we say donkey, in the relationship. So Joe Biden definitely made some interesting gaps and mistakes, but he did speak and really admit probably what even his handlers couldn't, probably cringing at, that his administration has made serious mistakes in the entire U.S.-Israeli relationship. Now, of course, the Washington summit, what's curious about it is just the guests who've attended. We did have honorable members such as the Georgian Foreign Minister Ilya Dariashvili attend. We did have the Greek Prime Minister attend, as well as Viktor Orban and some of these other big characters, the new UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. And so, of course, primarily the main talking point of this NATO summit, just as the previous NATO summits and meetings has been the Ukraine-Russia war. It wasn't even Israel-Palestine, but it was definitely the support for Ukraine, and actually Blinken's idea of securing that $60 billion of US aid was mentioned as the US's sort of additional support for this NATO project of Ukraine that was spoken about. So again, no mentions of any peace treaties whatsoever, but they did speak, and it's essentially Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, at least he's the general secretary for this last NATO summit. He will be, there'll be a re-election very soon, and I think his tenureship will end. The Ukraine-Russia issue was the biggest talking point, and Ukraine's support has not really faltered amongst the NATO members. Some of the Eastern European states, especially led by Hungary, Viktor Orban was very critical of what was taking place, and it does seem like he is carrying a certain message of seeking peace and the sobering idea, Conrad, of bringing this conflict to an end prior to it escalating into a World War III, because Hungary really doesn't want that. Hungary was, of course, literally, it was the country heavily involved in both World War I and II, as we can recall, the Austro-Hungarian Russian Imperial Front, and then, of course, Hungarian participation on the Axis forces against the USSR in the Battle for Budapest during World War II. Extremely hardcore. A lot of Russians and Hungarians died in that particular siege, but there was a lot of consideration going out to this NATO summit and striving for peace. But again, the talking points are all very hawkish, Conrad, and even more hawkish because they bring up issues such as the Russian-North Korean armament deal as like something very big and out of the ordinary, when in fact these armaments were laying there in North Korean storage for a while now, and it seems like it's almost like a non-issue. Like North Korea can do whatever it wants with its armaments. These armaments are not state-of-the-art. They're not hypersonic missiles or nuclear missiles. These are simply, you can say, post-World War II grade 20th century munitions, which frankly Ukraine has a lot more in storage, of its own, which is inherited from the USSR. So, kind of speaking about Russia as this ally of Eastern dictatorships is very hawkish, very anti-Russian, Russophobic rhetoric. And unfortunately, that was one of the main speaking points of this Washington summit. And naturally, the other negative thing was, of course, Sweden was officially, it acceded to NATO and it became a fully fledged member. So now we do see this definitely clamping down on Russian interests in Eastern Europe, and not even Russian interests, but definitely this is pressure on Russia having its Baltic Sea neighbors directly now joining this anti-Russian alliance. It's just incredibly negative, and it does directly tie into what we speak about on the show, which is the coming World War III, this hot conflict which will most likely take place as per the prophecies of the saints.
Now, this meeting in many ways is just one of the diplomatic fronts of World War III, I would say, and we're seeing a big development being the Armenians showing up to the NATO summit. Of course, they were also in Washington for the U.S. brokered peace talks with Azerbaijan. Both the Azeri and Armenian foreign ministers were in town for this, but the reality that the Armenians also showed up to the NATO summit was, a big deal, despite the fact that Armenia had already left the CSTO. For them to so quickly, immediately be showing up at NATO summits, especially in the midst of Georgia, now being basically shunned from kind of the EU NATO sphere with its recent developments, with its laws, anti-LGBT, anti-foreign agent and whatnot. It seems that Armenia is totally becoming the new Caucasian center for Western operations in the region, to work against Russia, to work against Iran, despite the fact that Armenia is such a close ally of Iran. I'm going to talk about all of these dynamics in an upcoming article I have about Cyprus and the future of Northern Cyprus recognition, but Iran seems to be maintaining frame and supporting Armenia, but I doubt that will last considering Armenia's rapid shift, towards the West right now. Maria Zakharova recently made a comment about this because there are other big exercises coming up between Armenia and the U.S., and she says the upcoming exercises between these two countries, called Eagle Partner, cause nothing but regret, especially in light of Armenia freezing its membership in the CSTO. They undermine the prospects of established mechanisms between Yerevan and Moscow on security issues. And of course, Azerbaijan was also in town. I don't believe they showed up to the NATO meeting. Maybe I'm missing something. But of course, Azerbaijan and Belarus have becoming much closer recently. Pezeshkian, an Azeri Kurdish Turk, the new president of Iran. Some people think, of course, Erdogan said that their relations with Turkey and Iran would be, mending quickly because of this. Perhaps Azeri-Iranian relations will be improving as well, considering that Pezeshkian comes from that ethnic group. I talk about all of this in my Northern Cyprus article as well. So some very interesting developments regarding Armenia and Azerbaijan at the NATO summit. But you mentioned Biden's comments. Dmitry Biden said all sorts of other silly things, though maybe he said them more cogently than he usually does. But he talked all about how Hamas is unpopular in the West Bank and all of these other things, which are provably false. All sorts of recent polls have proven that Hamas is actually more popular than it's ever been in the West Bank due to the ongoing situations, in Gaza, the genocide going on there. But he also made statements basically indicting the Israelis, and you mentioned how he talked about mistakes he made running the Israeli issue and with the relationship with Israel. He talks about how basically there were things that he wanted the Israelis to do that they just flat out didn't do, and he wasn't capable of getting them to do it. He says that nationalists and conservative members of the Israeli war cabinet sabotaged his plans and basically succeeded. So it shows you that, the hardcore Chabad Lubavitchers and those types, your bring back the third temple, wave the crown, antichrist flag, these are the people that are actually in charge. People say that Israel is actually occupied by the U.S. This is the nonsense that Haas and Jackson Hinkle will spew at you when they try to tell you that, world Jewry doesn't control the world. But look, Joe Biden and his impotent, State Department and the U.S. power that, the largest navy in the world, it's all nothing against the true power of Jewish revanchism and Jewish supremacy that controls finance in the U.S., controls foreign policy on both sides, and of course, obviously, is in power in Israel and is conducting a genocide right now. So obviously, some of that nonsense from the MAGA communists really needs to go, and it proves that really kind of an op going on there at this point. I don't know what's really going on there. Maybe more coming forth on that from us as well. But there was also some things going on in the Pacific, Dimitri. I don't know if you have anything else to say about Biden's comments about Netanyahu, because we are going to talk about the Holy Land soon as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The Pacific was another talking point, not as large as the Russo-Ukrainian Eastern European situation, but I think it was brought up, and we are closing in on the end of 2024 now. We are in the second half of the year, and as we've spoken about, the predictions are that in 2025, there will be a very large-scale escalation in the Pacific, in the anti-Chinese rhetoric, especially now that Donald Trump, his victory is kind of looming over the horizon. So we do know that China will be the new sort of target of, and perhaps this will even lead to a closening of Russia, as we've spoken about, but not getting too much off topic. The NATO Pacific situation, what is happening. So we do have Lin Jian, the Chinese foreign minister, ministry spokesperson. Actually, I'll just quote him directly. He says, "As China, we deplore and strongly oppose the NATO summit declarations, which hype up tensions in the Indo-Pacific region and is full of bellicose remarks with a Cold War mentality. Its contents are directly aimed at China and are filled with bias, smearing, and provocation." So what is he speaking about exactly? Well, we didn't have any representatives from Taiwan at this summit, which is interesting. Not the prime minister, not the foreign minister, nor the president. But we did have the South Korean, and of course, South Korea is not a member of NATO, being a Pacific East Asian nation, right? It makes sense. But Yoon Suk Yeol, the president of South Korea, was present. And of course, Fumio Kishida, the prime minister of Japan, was also present at this NATO summit. And one of the discussion points was the creation of this NATO branch, or essentially this Pacific version of NATO. I'm not sure what the abbreviation would be, Conrad, because, the North Atlantic, Treaty Organization doesn't really apply to the Pacific. But in theory, they did discuss very openly a strategic Western, shall we say, democratic liberal alliance in the Pacific, which will, NATO being a defense treaty, it's less focused on trade, rather it's very focused on military defensive action against the USSR and now Russia, and of course any other opposition that they may face in the Middle East and Europe. But this new alliance in the Pacific that they're hypothetically forming in their minds and even in their papers and their speeches is one which potentially they would have a benefit to create. Like, if you really think about it, China is quite powerful at the moment. It's growing even more powerfully. Economic growth has been stifled slightly since COVID, but China's still on the rising up. It doesn't really have an aging population, really hasn't kicked in yet. Meanwhile, its main opposition, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, are facing really interesting prospects going into like 2050 and later on in the 21st century, as well as the pressure to keep up their militaries and strengthen, allocated quite a large proportion of their GDP or even the credit they receive from other nations such as the US in order to bolster up their military. So why not have these three US aligned nations actually unite into, say, a defensive treaty, so Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, and oppose the Chinese expansion into the Pacific and even protect their own interests? It would make complete sense. And this is what essentially the Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson mentioned here. And it's completely possible. The reason there was no one from Taiwan at the summit, I think, is because Taiwan at the moment, as we'll speak about later in the show, is facing extreme pressure from China. We remember when Nancy Pelosi arrived in Taiwan, there was even threats that she would get bombed out of the sky or something. There was all kinds of fake news being spread. But China takes the Taiwanese situation very, very seriously. We do know Anthony Blinken is very pro-China. He visits China. There's some bizarre agreements there behind the scenes, and China does have strong ties, and economically speaking, with the US and the majority of the world, frankly. So it will be an interesting situation moving forward as to how these three Western nations, South Korea, Japan, and of course Taiwan, kind of mend their ties and unite perhaps even their military leaderships, because these countries haven't had any, say, strong or really high-scale joint military collaborations recently. So, led by the US, frankly, a lot of these countries have US bases already, and perhaps even the Philippines will be involved in this too. So, who knows going forward? But this was one of the main issues at the summit, and I think this is quite serious. One of the other things I think, which was super relevant, you mentioned Armenia, Azerbaijan. The representatives of both of these countries were also present, and we do have a bizarre trilateral relation conjuring taking place here. And this is curious because perhaps this is being, again, assisted by France, Macron. You know, there's an interesting collaboration, Conrad, between these southern Caucasus nations, where you have the Georgian foreign minister being here, the foreign minister of both Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. All three of these countries present, speaking with, of course, the French foreign minister, the French president, Joe Biden. What is the plan of the West? Are they trying to unite the Southern Caucasus? Perhaps they're claiming that there needs to be a peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan in order to pressure Russia on the southern end. And perhaps this is another strategy of moving Georgia more into the US Western sphere of influence, especially after these LGBTQ reforms have fallen through. You know, maybe this is beneficial for the Armenians on the ground. Like, let's not say anything negative about the fact that peace is coming to the region after the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. But Pashinyan, is he really out there seeking what's best for his people long term, or is this just a short term kind of agreement between the Azeris and the Armenians? I mean, it's just extremely concerning because we do know with NATO ties and with these military alliances, Conrad, so comes this cultural liberal influence which degenerates your nation from the inside. We did see, of course, Mitsotakis, the Prime Minister of Greece, also present here, so he was part of the discussion, and of course the Turkish Foreign Minister present as well. So we did have literally that entire Turkish belt, except for Central Asia, of course, present at this NATO summit. It's really a conglomeration of the who's who of this future geopolitical layout, I think, especially in that southern Caucasus, southern Black Sea region. So extremely concerning.
Yeah, I think you're completely right on the growing suspicious behavior that's going to be going on in all of those regions. And I think one of the biggest escalations we saw this week in the war, on Russia by the powers that be that are trying to organize, all of these little states into their respective blocks against, the big regional blocks of Russia and China, like you mentioned with Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. That one's so funny to me because Japan, was the arch nemesis of all of those states, and China was their ally, against Japan in the Second World War. But, here we are, different times, right? But we saw Keir Starmer, the new ultimate Shabbos Goy, not even really a Goy anymore. I guess he's kind of member of the tribe by marriage at this point, talking about, the funny thing about him is that from a left-wing perspective, he's probably the most pro-Israel person you could get, like you mentioned, he's Jewish, he's very hesitant to support Palestine, to do anything that could favor the Islamic world or anything like that, but he's a major hawk on Russia. He recently gave Zelensky permission to use British Storm Shadow missiles on Russia proper. This is something that the U.S. has been much more hesitant and slow working to do, and slowly give them permission to use certain systems. But Keir Starmer comes in, first few days as prime minister, boom, just use these rapidly advanced weapons of mass destruction against the Russians. So it shows the ethnic animus that even comes through by marriage, towards the Russians in that regard, regarding this tribe. But it's a really unfortunate development. I wonder what his perspective is on all of the Pacific stuff. I know the UK has slightly less influence in the Pacific than it used to, obviously, but we know that Australia also is a perennial enemy of China, still in the Commonwealth. So I wonder if they will also be a part of the Filipino potential connection with, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan in this new Pacific NATO alliance. But unless you have anything else to say about all of that, Dimitri, we could probably discuss a few of the on-the-ground updates in the Holy Land and Levant between Israel, Palestine, the coming war with Lebanon. I know that, Egypt is still frustrated about the Philadelphia corridor in Gaza, and we hear that, despite the fact that the Hezbollah issue in Lebanon won't have anything to do with a potential Hamas ceasefire, it doesn't seem like a ceasefire with Hamas is on the horizon anytime soon either. So I'm wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, we have seen some recent developments between Cyprus and Israel. Like the strengthening of those two countries in relation to one another is quite curious. Joe Biden did mention at the summit the failed sort of peer operation, which has really gone underground. We're not even sure what the end goal of that project was, but in fact, this is probably the last mentioning of it because Joe Biden kind of closed the book on that particular issue. We do see, of course, operations in Rafah and the humanitarian crisis there continue. The losses mounting. The Hezbollah situation in the north is even more curious because at the moment we do see a strengthening of the Hezbollah bombardment of Israeli outposts. So this is the news quite recently. The Lebanese resistance brigades on Friday, actually the 12th of July, they've bombed a Ruwais al-Qarn Zionist outpost on, this is again the Sheba Farms region, which is like right on the border of Lebanon and Israel. So Lebanese brigades have been bombing this with anti-tank guided missiles, which, they're not the largest caliber of missile if you can speak about explosives, but Lebanon, as we know, has a large, again, armament going back decades to the 2006 war. They've been collecting, and they have munitions for every occasion. And because of the sort of short range targets, they're going to be shooting the Sheba Farms, a very peculiar sort of armaments. These are not the same ones that they were shooting at the Iron Dome. So it's a little bit different here, but definitely aiming at some of these Israeli positions, keeping the Israelis on their toes. Frankly, notice the Israeli army, Conrad, because we did see a lot of footage of all the northern highways and freeways up Israel towards the northern border, and all their military bases located there are being filled up with Israeli military. So they're actually being stationed there, but they're not informed to actually go in and face Hezbollah. So they're standing there waiting. Essentially, it's very similar to maybe the Napoleonic Battle of Borodino, when there was a bit of a standstill, and Napoleon kind of told his troops to stand and not really advance on the Russian forces during that Napoleonic War. And so the Israelis are essentially standing there waiting, witnessing Hezbollah bomb all of their farm strategic zones. They're witnessing Israeli refugees from these conflict zones moving south, and eventually it is demoralizing, because again, the entire media of the world, and a lot of these Israelis do have mobile phones, have connections to the internet. They're all watching Israel being demonized by the majority of, say, liberal media. Now, those who aren't Zionist are very critically viewing the Israeli operation in southern Lebanon and the bombardment of civilians, and they're being demoralized, and they're just standing there. And as we spoke about with Isaac, a lot of these conflicts are very much based on the morale of the troops. We did see that in the Russo-Ukrainian war. This was a major factor of essentially the demoralization of both the Ukrainians now, especially after the failed military operation in Zaporozhye in the middle of 2023, as well as what happened to the Russian forces in September of 2022 when they needed to retreat, and it kind of stopped Russian advances. And even there was a lot of blackpilling and depression in online chats. And Israel's facing a similar thing. They're witnessing Hezbollah essentially indiscriminately bombing a lot of these Israeli sites, and there's no real retaliation besides Israeli warplanes flying over Lebanese villages and essentially bombing alleged Hezbollah military sites, which turn out to be civilian villages. We did have some footage of, not footage, but news of actually Lebanese Christians being killed in a recent bombardment by the IDF Zionist Air Force. So it's just, the conflict will continue to go on, and until the Israelis actually decide to either seek peace with Hezbollah or move in on the ground, their forces and their morale will continue to diminish. And I think this is a major factor, which frankly, you can see the stress on Netanyahu's face now every time he does an interview, or he realizes the situation is reaching like a critical mass, and the decision is frankly on him. It's on his defense minister and all these hawks in the government, whether or not to actually seek peace with Hamas, with Hezbollah, or to actually go in on the ground. And frankly, we don't even know what's, it's hard to say. We obviously, Conrad, don't want an escalation, and this is, no real Christian wants that. But in fact, at this point, it almost seems as if Israel does decide to go in, victory may not be on their side. It's not as obvious as perhaps as it was in October, November, when they quickly reacted to the Hamas advancement in Gaza and around the Negev desert areas. So a very interesting development on the Levant end. And I think coming forward, like all the predictors and political commentators, especially on the Russian side and in America, they have stated that this July is a very tense month, because frankly, at any point, Israel may greenlight that invasion of southern Lebanon, which we've been talking about for a few weeks now, but it literally may happen in the middle of the week, and there'll be a lot of very tragic and tumultuous news that will be coming out of that area.
Yeah, that invasion of Lebanon, again, I think July is still the month we're going to see the beginning of that, but August could be when it happens as well. Obviously, we're keeping in contact with Isaac, keeping in contact with the sources we know on the ground there, so going to be watching it closely. We know that Hezbollah has been spotted training in joint drills with Iraqi and Syrian Shia resistance forces, all the militias that have united there since October 7th in, conjunction with the Houthis and all the other forces that are fighting, with Hamas, trying to disrupt, the Zionist entity's operation against the Gazans. But in the midst of all of that, we remember a few weeks back, we talked about Hassan Nasrallah warning Cyprus that if they allow Israelis to use, their island to refuel and basically participate in operations both against Lebanon and against Gaza, that they would retaliate against them, because Hezbollah has missiles that can reach Cyprus, that can hit Cypriot ships and British ships in Cyprus. We know that huge swaths of Cyprus are British military bases, naval and otherwise. So very relevant. And there's even, neocon rumors going around that supposedly Iran is funding operations and training militants in northern Cyprus, which, is Turkish occupied. So all of these things kind of come together in that regard. But, if these flights that we've been seeing, British flights from Cyprus to Jordan, continue in that level of collaboration with other, powers and regional entities that have U.S. bases, these British flights are I'm sure flying to the British bases in Jordan that work with the United States bases in Jordan that shot down the Iranian, strikes into Israel that were a response to those strikes on their embassy. So again, Cyprus seems to be very much involved in all of this, and so this could widen because those British flights this week to Jordan have been increasing. So I pray that Cyprus can stay out of this because we don't want them to get involved in a negative capacity. We know the prophecies actually speak of the Turkish troops leaving, which I go into all of that in my forthcoming article. It may already be out by the time this episode comes out. I may link it below. But yeah, the other thing going on in that Turkish world relating to northern Cyprus, last week we talked about, this Union of Turkish States organization meeting. It actually took place in Karabakh. So Azerbaijan really asserting Nagorno-Karabakh as its territory, inviting all of these Turkish states to meet there. So that's all very fascinating. And Dmitry, you mentioned the Caucasus meeting there between all of the Caucasian states. This region is going to be so relevant, in the forthcoming developments in the Third World War. And I don't know how hot it will be specifically, but the shifting in bloc politics that come with these little countries and how people have to align, including Cyprus and recognizing Northern Cyprus. This really is going to be, where the blocks in the World War III, I guess you could say the sides are kind of created. So very interesting developments, to say the least. We also saw strikes into Lebanon by Hezbollah forces that were actually Orthodox Christian. It was a Orthodox Christian missile squad from the southern town of Marjayoun in Lebanon. They are part of the Lebanese Resistance Brigades, which is a quote-unquote non-denominational wing of Hezbollah. They've been resurrected. They've been, I guess, defunct since 2000 when they were fighting Israel back then. So this is made up of a bunch of basically non-religious Shias. So there's Sunnis, secular Shia, Christians, I guess even Druze are somehow involved in this. But apparently the missile squad that conducted this first operation, which was against the Sheba farms, which are Lebanese that are currently occupied by Israel, ATGM missiles were used, and apparently the squad that did this were Orthodox Christians. So we're seeing basically some of the first Christian soldiers engage the Israeli Jews directly, the Zionists, in combat. So I always knew the Orthodox were more gung-ho about fighting Israel than the Maronites were, and it seems that this is showing through with this squad that I guess were pretty eager to shoot something directly at Israel. So, Dimitri, I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. I think, well, Orthodox Christians naturally, when they see their neighbors in trouble, when they see the bombing of their school friends, their even their Muslim friends that they work with every day, that they see these areas of southern Lebanon essentially be classified as an entire target. So, think about it. A quarter of the country is at threat of an Israeli bombing at any time. I mean, this is really concerning. And as Orthodox Christians, historically, we've always been accustomed to serving in the armed forces of our respective nations, or even militia groups, right? It doesn't even have to be an official military, in defending our neighbors, our loved ones. And this is essentially what these Lebanese Orthodox Christians are doing. This is completely normal and really can't be looked down upon. I'm sure their local Orthodox Christian priests, members of the Antiochian Church, of the Jerusalem Patriarchate, they're all in support of these particular acts of, selflessness. Because, as we as Orthodox Christians, when we go to battle, and this is like something that's very curious, is we essentially go not to fight and kill other people. The main goal is to die for our neighbors. It's self-sacrifice that's really important here. The goal is not to commit manslaughter, murder, to kill with intent, to annihilate the enemy. The goal is to do good and actually love your neighbor and self-sacrifice yourself. So this is what Christian warriors and soldiers do, and I think the Lebanese are actually showing that very actively, even in their small minority numbers. And it's not surprising that the Maronites, these are Roman Catholic aligned Christians of Lebanon, are actually more siding with the Zionists and Israelis. We've been covering this for a few months now, but this shouldn't surprise anybody, because as we know, the Roman Catholic Church unfortunately has very much aligned itself with the Zionist cause ever since Vatican II, and even I would say before that, ever since the Vatican during the Renaissance has invited Jewish bankers and merchants into all these Italian cities and began making these usurious deals, which led to the downfall of Europe. I think we can all make those connections very swiftly. It's been the last 500, 600 years, and this has been developing, and now look, we see Christians dying, their Muslim friends passing away as well, being bombed indiscriminately by the unaccountable forces of Israel, the Zionists, who are building essentially essentially the project of the third temple, bringing in the Antichrist. I mean, Tel Aviv itself, Conrad, has literally built the main municipality, the metropolitan area. It's called Gush Dan. You know why? Because the tribe of Dan used to be situated right where Tel Aviv is. So they built their new capital city on the territory of the tribe of Dan from the ancient Israeli, before Christian times of the Old Testament. This is so explicit. These people know exactly what they're doing. We spoke about the elite forces of Israel with Isaac as well, where, they claim they have all these snake symbology. They're naming their commanders like Cobra, and I don't know if this is a G.I. Joe reference, but they're like Commander Cobra, Commander Viper, whatever, Serpent. These people, they know the snake symbology. They're using symbols, they're using insignias, they know exactly what they're working towards. And I think the Christians as well on the ground are beginning to understand that this is a battle which will go into those eschatological times. We don't really need to cover that again. We kind of mention that on every episode, but frankly, it does continue to shock me that this is taking place in such clear view. It's no longer esoteric, it's no longer occult or hidden away from the mainstream view. It's kind of like in your face. And that's a little bit, scary, because it's no longer sort of prophecy that we're speaking about. It's reality. It's what's happening now. It's not even history. It's, modern realities we're kind of facing here. So, we did have Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, clearly say, where are the Arab and Muslim people with what is happening in Gaza? The outburst, the cry for the Gazan people continues to go out to the, Muslim populations of the Hejaz, of the Arabian Peninsula, and even Iran, I would say, with the new president. What kind of decisions will be made in order to support the Palestinian people who are, they're dwindling on life and therefore approaching 200,000 casualties, according to that new article that we spoke about last week. It's a horrendous humanitarian situation, and it is on the Sunni Muslims and even the Shia Muslims, because there are Shia Muslims in Palestine who are currently dying under Israeli bombardment and humanitarian issues and, essentially the destruction of hospitals. If I can imagine, Conrad, all of those people suffering from, cancer, insulin shortages have probably already passed away in Gaza. I'll just be completely honest. Can you imagine the medical shortage? People just needing treatment and simply not getting it because all the basic hospitals have run out of gas, energy, power, medication, and the French are dropping the British are dropping their munitions and humanitarian aid into the Mediterranean Sea, as Isaac described. I mean, that is a very special episode everybody really needs to kind of watch. And, the situation is getting worse. And frankly, there is nothing on the horizon except for Hezbollah acting with its military might that it's accumulated over the last 2 decades and actually forcing Israel into a peace treaty, both with itself as well as with Hamas. And, it's interesting because the IDF, not only is it, provoking these actions by, attacking Hezbollah chiefs, but recently we had news that the IDF has assassinated the former bodyguard of Hezbollah's leader, Nasrallah, actually. So the main bodyguard, who you can always see in photographs next to Nasrallah, he's gone missing. And the idea is that allegedly he's been killed in an aimed bombardment. They probably thought Nasrallah was in the same car as his bodyguard. So we have Israel just playing assassins, as they were, like historically speaking. These people are, terrorists. I think not all the Israeli people, but specifically the government, the leadership of the military. And I think you can see how serious it is because it's almost like they're planning another Shoah. And I don't mean to joke about this lightly, but we are seeing even Yoav Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, he began speaking, Conrad, about recruiting Orthodox Jews into the IDF, which normally there's some really these Talmudic, Orthodox, Chabad, weird sectarian Jews who are very, very stringent and very strict on their ideology and their religious practices, which are, frankly, have nothing really to do with the Old Testament. It's always it's an amalgamation and essentially a mutation of what was in the Old Testament. But we do see these people essentially walk away from military service because they claim they can't really spill blood, they can't kill people, etc. There's all these weird pretexts to this. But now we see the defense minister actually actively call and establish that, yes, these Orthodox Jews, the ones with the funny hair and the black hats living in these specific neighborhoods across Israel and essentially settling the West Bank, now they must be conscripted too. So you can see the situation is getting extremely desperate. And in some ways, it does mimic what took place prior to World War II in Europe, when you had certain Jewish communities perhaps become isolated and they were used as cannon fodder by, let's just say, the international Jewry, international community, and sacrificed to, say, perhaps the whims of the Axis forces. They were left there, these bizarre Jewish communities left to, what later became the sort of the myth of the Holocaust. And they were left there to die and left there to essentially, face the wrath of both the Soviet forces and the Third Reich. So they were essentially, and this is one of the theories, that those Jews were seen as cannon fodder, left there to create what we see now as the state of Israel. And in fact, Yoav Gallant may be doing the same in the Holy Land now. He may be using these Orthodox Jews, sacrificing them, throwing them against Hezbollah, throwing them against Hamas, in order to probably push a further goal in the future and to bring more Israelis under this united, globalist, demonic, Talmudic agenda. Who knows what the end goal is, but it's always something malicious, it's always something quite dark. So we just have to kind of cover it and analyze the news as they come out.
the situation in the Holy Land obviously is going to be one of the main focuses, I think, until all sorts of the developments that we have seen prophesied by the saints come to pass. I think this is kind of the one insofar as, the cascading, series of events is going to get more and more dramatic. But we mentioned the Japan-NATO situation earlier. China, of course, has had some issues with Taiwan. They are every day setting new records for amounts of planes that have quote unquote violated Taiwanese airspace. Of course, China considers it their airspace. International law considers it their airspace. American State Department website considers it China's airspace. But I digress. Their ships are obviously violating the quote unquote territorial waters of Taiwan. They continue to advance on these shoals in the Philippines. And it appears that the Chinese had even captured certain Taiwanese fishermen that were fishing off of some of these Kinmen Islands or some of the other islands that are very close to mainland China. And the Taiwanese are, demanding them back. And I think even trying to claim that they'll get the U.S. involved to fight China for these fishermen. I don't think the U.S. will do that. But either way, China continues to press its claim as Japan and these other countries are used in the U.S.'s orbit to, scheme against them. But China also operating a bit far afield. They held joint drills with Belarus, not more than 90 kilometers, I believe it was said, from the Polish border. So Chinese-Belarusian joint drills right next to NATO territory. Very interesting. Of course, they insisted these were regular drills that have nothing to do with aggression on any given state, but of course that's going to spook, those guys a little bit, to say the least. And we know that Hungary obviously has been maintaining close ties with China, being against NATO's shift against China, as well as, of course, being against its moves against Russia. So Belarus and Azerbaijan and Hungary, the three of those countries, similar populations, similar sizes, they're actually all kind of helping each other out in the Russosphere. And not all those countries I'm a fan of. So it shows you that, strange bedfellows are often made, in the midst of the Third World War, am I right? Again, a lot of this is discussed in my upcoming Cypriot article, but I think the China situation is something that is going to slowly but surely snowball against the U.S., because the U.S. right now is trying to poke and prod and escalate in very specific fashions to get the Chinese to mess up. But as I've said a bajillion times, and people are probably getting sick of me saying it, the longer the timeline goes on, the more likely the Chinese are to win a confrontation in that region. And they're also, I believe, more likely to obtain a political reality where the vast majority of Taiwanese Chinese people living on, Formosa, the island, are sick and tired of being U.S. puppets and would rather just rejoin with their ethnic Han brethren, on the mainland and move forward with the nationalist Chinese vision. So I think that's the future for China-Taiwan ultimately. But unless you have anything else to say about that, Dimitri, I know there was something about a lot of Syriac Christians being killed and Syriac Christian towns being burned by Turkish troops somehow in the Iraq region. We knew Assad was invited to Turkey, that Turkish troops are pulling out of Syria in many ways, but it appears that their incursion into Iraq against the Kurds there continues, and I guess some Syriac Christians are getting caught in the crossfire. I don't know if you know anything about that, but if not, we can probably move on to Africa.
Yeah, I think frankly this news is still breaking that, now that the Turkish troops are going to withdraw from northern Syria, I think there will be a lot of interesting things uncovered. And I'm not saying that the Turks have committed war crimes or anything, but we know historically speaking, Turks and, their militaries especially, it's just say from an Islamic perspective, haven't been the most humanitarian in the way they've occupied some of their neighbors and other nations. And they do view northern Syria as essentially old Ottoman Turkish territory. So it wouldn't surprise me that as these news develop and perhaps going into next week, we will have more coverage of potentially these sort of last minute burial sites found of local people killed, maybe village skirmish confrontations. And in fact, the real truth will have to come out probably even long after that. It'll be a determination of exactly who committed the crimes. Conrad, was it the Kurds? Was it these various democratic US-led groups, these so-called Syrian rebels? Was it like ISIS? Or was it in fact the Turkish military? So I think there'll be a lot of investigation on Assad's end. But I think Assad, the government still has Russia's support in terms of, I think Russia has greenlit Assad's sort of ascension to this diplomatic relation with Turkey, and it sort of said, look, it's now or never, Assad. Like, you need to bring yourself close to Erdogan. There's a big opportunity here to actually have the Turks leave northern Syria, and then of course we can seek a rapprochement with maybe Iraq and get the Iraq government to organize some sort of, shall we say, peaceful exodus of the American troops out of both Syria and as well as Iraq jointly, kind of away into the Persian Gulf, and to leave these areas completely in their entirety. We do know there are still ISIS forces in some areas of Syria that the Russians are working on slowly but surely, and in joint sort of efforts with the Syrians. But yes, this is sort of an ever existing issue. Now, we do know the Islamic threat is as present in Syria as it is in Africa, in the Sahel belt, in that area, which covers most of the ECOWAS economic zone. And naturally, these countries will need to eventually, I mean, when we speak about North Africa and even the Northwestern African territory, there's a couple of issues. You have that post-colonial tension, Conrad, which continues and it's exploited by liberals like MAGA communists and all these bizarre clowns online, which frankly, I'm not going to say it's completely false. Some of these concerns about post-British, post-French control of some of the industries in these nations. I mean, that's a real thing. Capitalism did develop, frankly, Protestant capitalism did develop out of, say, Jewish influence and that sort of real capitalist degenerate ethics. It did come from some very questionable roots in the 1500s and 1600s, that sort of Adam Smithian vision of what European economics should look like. That is still very much in possession of that northwestern African zone. So I think these African countries, not only are they facing that heritage, which they need to deal with, kind of internalize and process it, but they also need to, of course, deal with the Islamic threat. And a lot of these Islamic groups, especially coming out of Libya, which Libya is still basically, I don't know how to say this nicely, it's essentially the Somalia of the 1980s and 90s, right? It's this completely lawless zone where essentially you have CIA agents, you have all kinds of American black sites, who knows what's exactly taking place there, but it's basically a cauldron which is cooking up Islamists who are then invading Burkina Faso, Mali, and these Islamists are working on destabilizing these countries or potentially keeping these countries under tension. So now, naturally, this new Sahel Confederation will need to deal with both the threat of UK, French, ECOWAS-led intervention, as well as Islamic threat. And that's, I think, something that can unite them. We do know Wagner has been working very actively, kind of covertly. Surovikin is somewhere in that area. We do have these new Russian military coordinated forces and commanders who are working with Wagner and most of these African nations to deal with the Islamic threat. So as much as we don't necessarily maybe like mercenaries and the fact, there is this like questionable ethics of mercenary actions, and we do know there's a very mysterious and I think quite sad history of exactly what was taking place in eastern Ukraine and Donbass, Donetsk, Lugansk, essentially in Novorossiya, that particular area in 2014 and 15, exactly who assassinated some of the leaders such as Moscovoy, Givi, Motorola, and Zaharchenko. There's some real curious questions as to who exactly killed those men. I don't want to get into details about that, but this idea of mercenaries acting in Africa, it's one of the strong points, I think, of future, shall we say, multipolar, anti-Western, and we can say it quite obviously, anti-Zionist relations with these African nations. I mean, it's a common ground that they can build upon. And we do know, of course, these countries are still majority Muslim, Conrad. Islam is something that unites them, but they are against this radical Wahhabism, Salafism, which Wahhabism, just to reiterate, Wahhabism is this very puritanical, anti-traditional form of Islam, which essentially is it's almost an iconoclastic type of Islam. It's a very extreme Islam, and that radicalizes itself very, very clearly. And obviously, we see that in the Northern Caucasus and Dagestan, Ingushetia, Chechnya, and of course, it came out of Saudi Arabia. It's very closely tied to the House of Saud, which now rules over the majority of the Arab world, and it's very influential. So Wahhabism is this very strange, almost like a Protestant version of Islam, which escalates into radicalism. So these countries are very much against that because, again, they're African, Conrad. They have all kinds of they have the big, I'm not going to say like voodoo masks, but these Africans have their own local traditions, which they, integrate into with Islam, and have a lot of local customs, which frankly, Islam is a semi-pagan religion anyway. So why not let them sort of combine the two and just have their fun, have their peaceful sort of local traditions? I mean, in a Duganist sense, right? Let them sort of be cannibals in a happy environment. But Wahhabism goes against that. And the Wahhabis and radicals, these proto-ISIS groups that have taken over Libya, they do pose a threat to this new Sahel alliance. So I think that's essentially where kind of that area stands, and that's probably why these Sahel countries, Burkina Faso specifically, are strengthening their military in order to face any sort of external threat, be it ECOWAS, UK, France, Islamists, any sort of US-led intervention. I mean, because we do know the US is like an octopus. It is planting its tentacles on various places and controlling all kinds of groups. We have seen that recently. So super complex situation there.
Yeah, Burkina Faso adding at least 10,000 new troops to its ranks, which, it doesn't sound like much when we're talking about Ukraine and these other countries. But for West Africa, that's a lot of people, and that's, a substantial force. And you talked about ECOWAS, of course. If the Sahel Confederacy emerges, ECOWAS has said that, it might not even be able to maintain relevance without some of these countries that it used to have contributing to it. And I don't know if some of those other countries like Senegal or Togo or some of those other countries that at certain points signaled certain support for those juntas. I don't know if they'll ever rejoin the Sahel Confederation if they start doing better than ECOWAS, but we know that Burkina Faso has also criminalized homosexuality. And you mentioned Islam. Yes, Burkina Faso is about 63% Muslim, but it's also a quarter Christian, mostly Catholic. So this is you mentioned Duganism, this is a joint Christian-Islamic alliance against, worldwide homosexuality, globo homo. So we like to see that, obviously. Perhaps they will now be blessed in their Sahel Confederation alliance. But if we go a little bit eastwards, we get to Sudan, and the Rapid Support Forces have been making rapid gains in Sudan, which is interesting because we had seen Russia perhaps pivot its support towards the mainstream recognized Sudanese government as they promised to give them a Sudanese port on the Red Sea, which the Rapid Support Forces previously, in theory, if they had taken over, would have been able to provide the Russians. But in the midst of all of this new territorial gains from the Rapid Support Forces, the president of Sudan, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, he has rejected the Ethiopian calls for negotiations that the Ethiopians would mediate and try to reach a conclusion. He's rejected those and made this statement. He said, "There is no forgiveness for these crimes. This battle will end with the crushing of the rebels. We are not engaging in negotiations anywhere, neither in Jeddah nor in Switzerland." So he seems to be, saying that this is, all or nothing war, and the death count is really rising in Sudan. So this is very unfortunate, and you start to realize, you have Sahel, Sudan, the rest of the Red Sea region, all the way up to the Holy Land in the Levant, Turkey in Iraq, the Caucasus, Ukraine. I mean, this is like an unbroken belt of conflict all around, the old civilizational center of the world, from the oldest realm of Christendom, from basically Ethiopia up all the way to the Black Sea. It's basically all engulfed in conflict right now. And then you add, the South China Sea stuff, the Myanmar stuff, even the India-China border, India-Pakistan. It's like, man, it really, really is World War III. You start to realize these World War Now guys aren't as crazy as you might have thought, right? So very, very interesting times we live in. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on Sudan or any of the other stuff. I know last week we talked about Ethiopia, Somalia. That stuff is still ongoing. I don't think that they have reached any concrete agreements, so that is still very likely to go hot. We know the Houthis are still doing their thing, blockading the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, the Gulf of Aden. They again still maintaining their frame as the most effective wing of, I guess, the resistance. Hezbollah, they may be about to step up and, overtake them, but we're always watching. But yeah, totally fascinating developments around the world, Africa, Asia, all over.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is we do see that Turkish collaboration with the Somalians. We spoke about that last week. We see Russian presence. Firstly, we see Chinese money all over Africa and the Middle East and countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan. China's building relations through its economics, and we see Russia building relations through its military sales, because the one thing Russia really does have an industrial base is its armaments, which it inherited from the USSR. And the USSR, frankly, inherited all these military factories which Russia built up prior to World War I from the Russian Empire, from the Russian Orthodox Christian emperors, right? Because we do know most of the chemical plants, most of the factories which built the tanks that fought in World War II were built during Nicholas II's reign, frankly. So really this inheritance of a military industrial complex that Russia is now exporting to all these various countries fighting against the multipolar hegemonic world was established under an Orthodox empire. So if you really think about it, Russia's returning to its roots. Again, trading arms to various countries around the world irresponsibly is probably very concerning, I think, from a Christian ethical perspective. But you do see the need of these various countries sort of establishing relations, and sometimes you do need to trade armaments in order to really create those bonds, right? There needs to be some sort of a connection on a more palpable level, and of course, defending one's own country. Like, what is more precious than that? I think for all these countries with very recent young sovereignty, which they need to defend, especially you mentioned Africa, Conrad. It's just a decade in Africa. It's like that meme: every 60 seconds a minute passes in Africa. Every 10 years is like 100 years in terms of stability. You do need to strengthen that. You need to outlast a generation or two or three, and then your country. Like ECOWAS is one of the most, despite it being like a French and a really Western type of economic alliance, it has withstood for 50 years, which is quite an achievement for an African playing field. So interesting where this Sahel Confederation goes. But in terms of military bases, we do see, of course, interesting satellite footage. Now, it's interesting where this satellite footage comes from. Most likely US satellites, because frankly, we do know, Conrad, from discussing Antarctica and these various secret places around the world, when the US doesn't, and Western NATO countries, when they don't want a specific base, like in the Negev desert, you can't really zoom into these Israeli bases. Where does Israel store its nuclear munitions and its missiles, right? Because Israel does have these nuclear sites, and in the Negev desert, you can't actually find them them on Google Maps and all these other websites that let you really zoom in on these on this sort of large scale maps and to find certain ideas. So the US scraps things for its allies, but when it needs to expose Chinese bases, they somehow are allowed to be visible. So we do see a Tajikistan military base being constructed by China allegedly in Tajikistan in order to defend the Tajik people from the Taliban aggression from Afghanistan, its next door neighbor. But I think that's a bit questionable. What we do have, I think, the reality is Tajikistan is between a rock and a hard place. It's not the closest country to Russia, and Alexander Bastrykin, one of the chief prosecutors of the Russian Federation, has been speaking out very openly against Tajik immigration. We do know that was a big deal during the Krakow City Hall when you literally had Tajik illegals commit the terrorist act, and frankly, we know who paid for them, whether or not it was Mossad, CIA, who trained them, this sort of secret Hasidic imam who was messaging them over Telegram, and they committed this act on the eve of Purim, but they were still Tajik nationals. And so these madmen came from this country of Tajikistan, which now is building relations with China. We did have the Tajik ambassador speak out very openly, and he stated that Russians were being racist towards the Tajiks, and now Tajikistan, similar to Kazakhstan, is choosing to perhaps align itself more with China rather than Russia, because they do have this post-Soviet, post-Russian imperial heritage, which they're kind of stating that, well, potentially we don't want to fall under Russian influence again, because if the Russian Empire reestablishes itself, we definitely know Kazakhstan is going to fall under that influence. But how far south will Russian influence go? Uzbekistan, perhaps even further than that. So Tajikistan is maybe choosing China rather than Russia in this coming conflict. We do know there's prophecies of the saints about a future, very far into the future, conflict between Russia and China, which a lot of the Russians you met with, Conrad, in Russia actually spoke about this. They're very aware of these prophecies, like the one of Saint Seraphim of Viritsa, Saint Jonah of Odessa. There's some very scary times potentially coming up for those Siberian, Central Asian regions where Russia does meet China in these border territories, which frankly we don't think about these days because most of our focus is on the Caucasus, on Eastern Europe and the Middle East. So who knows where these sort of developments hypothetically will go in the future. But just keeping in mind, there are things brewing in Central Asia, and I think it goes beyond just that consideration of the Turkic alliance, which Turkey is trying to construct. So quite scary. And just to kind of on that note of military bases, there is another base which Abkhazia, that post-Georgian territory on the coast of the Black Sea, next to Novorossiysk, the Russians are constructing a new military base on the east coast of the Black Sea, which is curious because this may in fact impede any NATO or EU project of building military harbors in the Black Sea, say from the perspective of Georgia. So Georgia does have a pretty large harbor on the Black Sea, and that port may be used for the storage of NATO military vessels if Georgia was ever to join NATO, which again probably won't ever happen, but who knows, right? Finland is a member of NATO now. So Abkhazia is sort of another site where Russia is looking to cement itself, and perhaps it's in mirror opposition to those military harbors on the western side of the Black Sea, which are controlled, which have been used during World War II when the Romanian submarines dominated the Black Sea during the Second World War. So who knows? These things, we all need to pay attention to them and frankly see how this develops into the future.
No, I totally agree. Big things are brewing in Central Asia, but before we pivot to the ecclesial sphere and then wrap things up, we have to talk about the ongoing election fiasco in France, which has yet to resolve. They don't have a government. We are hearing about potential collaborations between National Rally and the far-left NFP government. There was a rumor by somebody that the National Rally wouldn't vote no confidence immediately on a far-left-led government, but Marine Le Pen denied this and said that they would vote no confidence on any government not having any of the, more centrist or other ministers in it, that because some people are trying to have only the left-wing parties in power because they got the most votes in theory in this coalition, while others are trying to bring in more moderates, and obviously National Rally is trying to have a more moderate government. But ultimately Mélenchon, the leader of the far left alliance, he is proposing Huguette Bello as the prime minister, who is from Réunion, France, who's a member of a post-Marxist party, and they're, a member of the pretty far-left situation. So, she is currently in the seat to potentially be the prime minister. We're going to see where that moves forward, but next episode we may be telling you about the new government of France. But Macron, he's slowly but surely being the last member of his party to be in any relevant form of power in France. So interesting developments as well. But the only other development we have is in the European Union Parliament. Obviously, we talked about how in previous weeks, the Patriots for Europe bloc, formerly the Identity and Democracy bloc, they kicked out the AFD So now they're made up of, the Philo-Semitic Fidesz from Hungary, which is Orban, National Rally in France, and then a few other of these nationalist parties. Not Maloney, she's in a different one, but I believe Lega with Salvini is in the Patriots for Europe. I believe the Vox Party in Spain, a few others. But then after they kicked out the AFD, there's now another bloc, the even farther to the right bloc now, the Europe of Sovereign Nations, which 14 of their seats, their biggest blocker from the Alternative for Germany, the AFD, followed by Konfederacja in Poland, which is the right-wing pro-monarchist party that Grzegorz Braun, the guy that used the fire extinguisher on the menorah in the Polish parliament, he's in that party. Then the Revival Party, which is an even farther right party to the right of Fidesz, which I believe is anti-Zionist and more critical of a lot of their stuff. They have 3 parties. Then Republika in Slovakia and a few other parties in some of these other countries, including Bulgaria, Czech Republic, and some others. So they have 25 members of the European Parliament in total, so a smaller bloc, but they're able to be much more radical, which I think is good. So they're much easier to support. The AFD will not be tainted by influence from these other European parties, which are frankly cucking everywhere they go. And the AFD, I believe, is inevitable. So, Ausländer Raus will be here, and it won't be like a cucked version like Maloney or Le Pen or these other silly female rulers that we're getting in Europe on these supposed right-wing parties. But unless you have anything else to say about that, Dimitri, we can probably talk about some of this church stuff. Probably the best news I've heard in a long time. El Piroforos, of all people, the bane of the American Orthodox Christian, the Archbishop of Goarch. He apparently at a recent Greek clergy laity, I guess, gathering or meeting, proposed and in some formal fashion suggested Elder Ephraim begin the process towards canonization, that they begin exploring and gathering evidence for his eventual canonization. I'm sure that will be a bit of a slow process. Again, he proposed less than 5 years ago. It was 2019. So very amazing to hear, but I'm wondering if this comes in tandem with him potentially being on his way out. We know that the Prime Minister of Greece and other people have really requested that Patriarch Bartholomew get rid of him. So maybe this is him trying to appeal to the American Orthodox to ingratiate himself to them. But unfortunately, the mere next day after he made this announcement, he celebrated a liturgy with 8 altar girls. So you really can't say too many good things about this guy, because I'd love to have an episode where we only say good things about El Piroforos, but then, he goes and does that. But if it's under him, or if it's his initiative that gets us Elder Ephraim as a saint, maybe he's thinking that will be enough to get him through the toll houses for all the other horrible things that he's done. So interesting there. But unless you have anything to say about any of that Europe stuff or what I just said, Dimitri, we got to talk about Romania.
Yeah, frankly, I completely agree. Like, in the European context, what Elpidophorus is trying to do with the Orthodox Church, manipulating it to win brownie points, this is only going to fall on his conscience, during the final judgment, when the Lord will ask of him, like, did you push this canonization of Elder Ephraim in order to increase your own clout? Because that's essentially what's happening here. I think that's the reality. This man has been doing everything that has been, he's contributed to scandalizing Orthodox Christianity the most, and I wouldn't be surprised if his motives behind the canonization of Elder Ephraim, who was an incredibly conservative elder and who essentially had very opposing beliefs to Elpidophorus, the archbishop. And in fact, it's questionable whether or not the two even met or even spoke in depth at some point. Perhaps any Greek Orthodox Americans could correct me. Maybe the two of them have had discussions in the past, because again, Archbishop Elpidophorus, he has been an archbishop for a while and probably a hieromonk before that, or an archimandrite. So maybe somebody could just explain to me, is there even a connection between these two, right? And sort of going forward, like these Ephraimite monasteries, I think they're kind of standing on this ground of Orthodox conservatism, this true sort of belief, this righteous, non-bending path, which I think is probably the correct way to go, especially in a place like America, which is on the front lines of literally fighting against this New World Order system, right? Because it's literally the country is occupied by the dark forces of, the future reigning Antichrist, right? So there's a lot of consideration going on there, and Archbishop Elpidophorus is not assisting us in this battle. He's actually working against us. And frankly, speaking about, before we get onto the really good news, Conrad, which I think I'll let you kind of speak about the amazing news out of Romania. There has been some incredible cringe coming out of Ukraine, coming out of the schismatics, which Elpidophorus supports and Bartholomew does too, and they've actually bolstered some of this clownery. So we had a very interesting interview on the official Ukrainian news site of a former priest monk, actually, Father Aristarch, who I say former because in 2014, when the Donbass situation occurred, he actually defrocked himself, and this is a hieromonk. This is a monk and a priest at the same time. And this man, his name was Alexei Cymbalk, and he went to join Right Sector and joined, these neo-Nazi Banderite group and went to fight against Russians. And he says that, and we know that there's no such thing as formal monasticism. When you become a monk, you cannot undo it. There's no, yes, you can be, as a priest or a clergyman, you can be defrocked, or you can go into retirement, but there's no way of taking this monastic oath off of yourself, right? So this guy is out there killing, allegedly, and he praises it. He says, yeah, I'm killing Russians since 2014, 10 years of it. It's just horrific, right? So this sort of Banderite propaganda has even reached certain, clergy, and he was never a member of the schismatics. He was actually a canonical under Metropolitan Onufri. So he was, this is horrifying, right? Horrifying news. The other real clownery really comes out, unfortunately, on the feast day of all Russian saints, which is the 7th of July, and this was almost a week ago now, but the 7th of July is a feast day in Eastern Europe and in Russia of the Orthodox local churches, which was established all the way back in 1547, when the Russian church celebrates all of the Russian saints who have shown forth from this land. So it's a very big feast day locally for Russians, for Belarusians, Ukrainians, all those people from this post-USSR, post-Russian imperial land. And it was established a long time ago during the reign of Ivan IV, nicknamed the Terrible, right? And it was established by St. Macarius. Now, this feast day was celebrated in Ukraine. What's interesting is Conrad, Metropolitan Onufri, during the liturgy on the 7th of July, he actually proclaimed it as the day of all Russian saints. So he noticed there was no weird Ukrainian nationalism coming out of the blessed Metropolitan Onufri of Kiev. Meanwhile, Sergei Epiphany Dumenko, the schismatic, held essentially like this massive liturgy in one of the occupied churches in Ukraine and proclaimed it as the feast day of all Ukrainian saints of Rus. Whatever that means. Like, the word Rus is not even in the Ukrainian constitution, by the way. You cannot Control F, the word Rus in the Ukrainian constitution, it's not there. Ukraine does not connect itself to that Rus or that Russian heritage at all, right? So it's completely foreign to that. And of course, these LARPers don't really care about that. And this is who, unfortunately, Patriarch Bartholomew supports. We also had more clownery coming out of alleged Bishop Alexander Drabenko, who held in one of the occupied churches inside of Kiev. There was a Banderite Azov battalion funeral going on, and you had literally people coming up. And I understand the sympathies these people have for the Nazis of the Third Reich, but it's really comical in a way, where you have these Ukrainians who, a lot of them were born and they grew up and went to Soviet school, wearing weird Nazi eagles with the swastikas, coming up during this funeral and essentially saying goodbye to this dead Azov battalion hero. And it's essentially what we have here is a Banderite funeral going on here. Now, we do know that's a LARP, especially considering the fact that the Chabad literally controls Ukraine. So you literally have Jewish oligarchs, Jewish money, and Jewish bankers in control of this entire organization, and they're funding these delusional Ukrainians, essentially proclaiming themselves as heirs of Hitler or something, going to these Orthodox schismatic funerals. It's the entire playground here is completely full of clowns, right? It's an entire circus, and I think it's quite demented. Fortunately enough, we do have Orthodox priests sort of speaking out against it. Father Gennady Shkil, formerly of Kherson, but again, he's been targeted by the SBU, who have proclaimed him a target. So the SBU have said they're looking into Father Gennady because he has an active YouTube channel, over 200,000 subscribers. They're going to be searching him, and actually, fortunately enough, he lives in Russian sort of zone of Kherson in the SMO, so he's safe from any, say, assassination attempts and things like that, because the Russians are actually tightly controlling the border. So the Ukrainians are out there hunting, and they're out there looking for targets and looking for people they can kind of put the blame on for their failures in the SMO, for their failures in this weird degenerate project. And of course, the battle for the faith continues in this SMO zone, this land, which unfortunately we did see, this is again one of the news stories, Conrad, that I think has caught a lot of people's attention. And frankly, we didn't even have the full data on this. This was the bombing of the children's hospital in Kiev, right? Because this is what took the headlines, and everybody spoke out about this. And on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, this is the canonical church, Metropolitan Onufri, on the website, Metropolitan Onufri made this proclamation. It said, "My heart is filled with sorrow from the terrible news of the destruction of the National Children's Hospital of Kiev as a result of the enemy shelling. The injuries to patients, children, parents, staff, and the death of 2 employees saddens me." So Metropolitan Onufri and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, unfortunately, has, I think, officially taken this position that the Russians have bombed the children's hospital. We have Western media sources reporting that allegedly 33 people have been killed, including children. Whoever hit the hospital obviously has made a very clear mistake. Now, I think it's a bit early, Conrad, to speak, to say out loud that it was the Russians who bombed it, because frankly, Russians don't just bomb hospitals. I think Russians have been shown to be very humanitarian and very careful and in how exactly they select their targets. It's not the IDF against Hamas here. It's not the IDF in Gaza and Palestine, where they're indiscriminately carpet bomb entire refugee camps and roads, and they're hitting humanitarian vehicles, things like that, and killing thousands of children. We don't see this in this particular conflict. But what we do see is, again, the hypocrisy, not calling Metropolitan Onufri specifically, but a lot of Russian liberals who are somehow still allowed in Russian Western sources. When Russians get bombed, like the cluster munition bombing in Sevastopol, when these ATACMS cluster munition missiles killed one child and 3 adults and injured 150 people. This is like and there's 17 people still in critical care in the Sevastopol hospital. Nobody speaks out in favor of Russian solidarity, that Russians need support. But when an unnamed missile, and it could be, and that's the thing, this missile that hit the children's hospital could have been a Ukrainian, out of date, unmaintained anti-air missile, which we've seen, we've literally seen one hit a Polish farmer in, I believe it was late 2022 or early 2023, which nearly started like a conflict between Poland and Ukraine when they literally shot an anti-air missile towards Poland and killed a farmer who was driving his truck. Like, this is the Ukrainian anti-air defense systems from the USSR days have not been maintained properly. The country is definitely corrupt. So we shouldn't really leave this hypothesis that perhaps this missile that hit the children's hospital, which is frankly a tragedy, and there is a lot of people who passed away in this, and this is a sort of an outcome of the horrific war which has been continuing for a few years now. But we shouldn't come to sharp conclusions about who was behind it, especially before any investigations. And frankly, Ukraine claiming that it was Russia right away without even looking into it is already suspicious, especially given the Bucha massacre hoax, given all the various other terrorist acts that they've committed on Russian territory, and claim the Russians have caused false flag attacks. I mean, it's just absolutely insane. So their track record of being truthful is incredibly questionable.
Yeah, we of course need to always be praying for the churches in Ukraine, and I think Metropolitan Onufri, of course, is in a tough spot. Obviously, he can't come out and be like, it was Ukrainian air defense, which I've already seen, some evidence for that it was a Ukrainian air defense that was redirected or misfired and hit this hospital. Obviously, there, in theory, could be more coming out in the future, but I agree. Obviously, we know that Russia is not indiscriminately aiming at hospitals in the same way that Ukrainians have done things now that Azov has been given the ability to strike Russia with ATACMS and apparently, I don't know, Storm Shadows and whoever else they can get now that they can get US and UK weapons. It might get crazier out there, but I don't know what the Russians would gain from doing this exactly. They eventually, like I say, want to rule over this territory, so they would like these children to become Russian citizens. They wouldn't want to bomb them. But moving away from, again, this last military analysis, it's time for some good news out of Romania, and we have 16 newly canonized saints. I know, so many, so we're going to be reading through these. This is from Wallachian Gazette. It says, the Synod of the Romanian Orthodox Church has approved the final list of the 16 venerables and confessors to be canonized ahead of the centennial of the Romanian Orthodox Patriarchate. And the centennial is the 100-year celebration of the Patriarchate, and it's going to be dedicated to the martyrs and confessors of the 20th century specifically. So these are the canonized saints. They are Father Dimitri Staniloae, who you've probably heard of, the most gifted contemporary Romanian theologian, one of the best contemporary Orthodox theologians, in general. We have Archimandrite Sofian Boigiu, Father Constantine Sarbu, Father Ilia Lakatusu, Hieroschema monk Paisi Olaru, Archimandrite Ilia Cleopa, Archimandrite Domeci Monalek, Archimandrite Seraphim Popescu, Father Liviu Galaction Munteanu, Archimandrite Gerasim Iscu, Protosyncelis Arseni Boca, Protosyncelis Vissarion Toya, Protosyncelis Kalistrat Bobu, Father Ilarion Philea, Father Alexandru Baltaga, and Protosyncelius Irakli Flokea. All of them except for Father Alexandru Baltaga, who died in a gulag in Kazan, Tatarstan in 1941, were persecuted by communist authorities, serving a number of years of prison, with some dying before they could be freed. Many of these guys are associated with the Iron Guard. You should be sure to listen to our episode with Momchilo Neveski about Codreanu and Romania and the Orthodox resistance against communism there. Obviously, it's a very big deal, and Father Justin Parvu is a more contemporary saint who had a lot of amazing things to say about all of these guys. Elder Cleopa especially is beloved by many people across the Orthodox world, so this is wonderful news, but unfortunately not everybody thought this was wonderful news. Of course, somebody had to come in and say something about this, and who could it have been, Dimitri? Who do you think had a problem with this? Of course, it was none other than Alexandru Florian, the director of the Institute for the Study of the Holocaust in Romania. So, of course, he had something to say. He himself is concerned about this news, about the preparation for these canonizations, specifically Ilia Lakatusu. And this is what he says. He accuses Lakatusu of having been a member of the Iron Guard between 1942 and 43 while serving at a parish in Transnistria, actually. And he hopes that the Romanian Orthodox Church will not canonize him and deem his World War II conduct not worthy of sainthood. And ultimately, this is nonsense. We know the Iron Guard was disbanded definitively in 1941. And this post from the Wallachian Gazette goes on to, that's on our World War Now Telegram if you want to check it out. It goes on to totally refute all the nonsense that these Jews are saying about this future Saint Ilie. And again, the Legionnaires, the Order of Saint Michael, the Iron Guard, they're very much slandered by the modern media, despite the fact that they never actually even achieved power, like, the Nazis or Mussolini's black shirts or other fascist movements. So it shows that even in their latent form, these reactionary Orthodox anti-communist movements are very frightening. But regardless, we have a bunch of amazing saints now, and Father Dmitry Staniloy is, again, an amazing theologian who has written so much dogmatic theology that has influenced most of the saints of our day. So it's wonderful that he'll be canonized, and a lot of these people are people that I've heard a lot about. So I'm excited to get, some new icons and talk about some of these saints with people and, get their intercessions and prayers. Dimitri, I'd love your thoughts on this joyous development.
It's wonderful news, Conrad. I mean, it's great to have this white pilling content to actually speak about. And I mean, it's rare that we get this massive group of saints who are canonized, who are unquestionably to be venerated and are unquestionable servants of Christ and his church that have contributed so much to the Romanian community. I think through their prayers and contribute and will contribute probably much more as the Romanian people begin praying to them, at least collectively speaking. Romania is a country currently occupied by NATO, just as it was occupied by the USSR prior to that. And, they were, of course, under a lot of pressure during the World War I Austro-Hungarian stage. The Romanians, I think, want a sort of civil, peaceful existence in Eastern Europe. They don't want to be at war with their neighbors. They want to peacefully develop the Orthodox Christian culture in the context of an Orthodox political reality. And this canonization, as well as potentially the future canonization of the undoubtedly great saints such as Valery Gafencu, who was proclaimed the saint of the prisons. He's a very famous saint who isn't part of this list, but surely will be, and naturally the eventual canonization of not just the Passion Bearer, but I would say officially the martyr Corneli Codreanu, right, who we spoke about in our A4 episode. This is the eventual complete unshackling of Romania from the chains which hold it down politically speaking, and this is the first step in that direction. And all these great saints, many of them unknown to me at the moment, but I'm hoping that with time there will be articles published about them so we could all read their lives. Specifically, this list is available on our World War Now Telegram channel, which Conrad so helpfully reposted, and we could actually look into their lives. Perhaps there'll be English translations of what exactly they did, how they suffered for Christ, and we can take heed and examples from them, especially as we move into this next, as per Father Seraphim Rose, this next stage of potentially other persecutions which will face in the West, in a lot of these countries, and Ukrainians are facing now. I mean, this is a really big deal to have more martyrs, confessors, passion bearers to venerate. And most of these people, as you said, Conrad, they're monks, fathers, clergymen who, as lay people, were very right-wing, conservative, orthodox examples in their local communities in Romania. And this is, of course, we're not saying this because we're all about being political, but frankly, this is the correct opinion to have in today's world, where frankly, there is no time, we don't have the luxury of being delusional. We're not in the early 2000s or 1990s. The world is reaching a certain pinnacle, at a certain climax of conflict at the moment, and it's good to have the correct ideas of how geopolitics, how reality actually functions, and the liturgy and venerating the saints, the lives of these great saints canonized by the Romanian local church help lead us in that correct direction, help filter our worldviews, and perhaps correct certain mistakes which we may have in them and lead them in the right direction, frankly, so that we are not confused and we are not misled and misguided by the servants of the devil.
I think that was very well said, and again, I'm very white-pilled about these canonizations, and the joy in heaven, I'm sure, is also immeasurable, so very excited. But unless you have anything else to say, Dimitri, I'm thinking we should probably wrap this up. Of course, worldwarnow.co, that's where you can find all of our writings, all of our episodes. You can get behind the paywall and hear every episode of Ether Hour. Of course, we have our recent episode with Isaac Swalem about Palestine. We have our latest Q&A thread up. That'll be linked. Obviously, if you want to ask us a question, you can get behind the paywall. There's a free trial as well, so you can try it out, ask us a question, see if you like our answer. And yeah, that's this week we're going to be doing the Ether Hour for that this month, answering all the questions in that thread. So look forward to that. That's worldwarnow.co. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, worldwarnow_. We've been blowing up there, huge viral posts. So be sure to check those out. A lot of deep lore. We're on Telegram, World War Now Telly. We're on YouTube, obviously. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're on Substack, subscribe there. If you're on YouTube, subscribe over on Substack. Make sure you're on both. Like the video, leave a comment. Subscribe, like I said, we're on Rumble as well, World War Now. Follow me on X/Twitter, GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. yeah, like I said, leave a comment. It really helps us out. We enjoy talking to you guys there. Get behind that paywall again. It really helps us do the weekly show for free as well as the secondary ether hours for all of our beloved subscribers. But we give you guys some free previews every once in a while. But yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to the canonization of Elder Ephrem. I think the next wave of Romanian canonizations can be Elder Justin Parvu and Codrianu, hopefully maybe at the same time, like they did this bundle. That would be wonderful. But we're seeing some great things in the church and many canonizations. Hopefully, Father Seraphim Rose on the way as well. But with all of that, Dimitri, I'll let you have the last word.
Yeah, God bless everyone. Thank you for boosting the algorithm, commenting on the YouTube video, liking it. These interactions help, of course, spread the actual podcast episodes. Perhaps they will show up on certain people's homepages, and naturally that sort of attention is very much required in this current sphere where YouTube really, the algorithm is essentially this machine led by AI sort of system. So we do need your support in terms of pushing the podcast forward and perhaps getting it to a larger audience. And I just want to say, closing thoughts, we hope the Romanian saints in heaven are praying for us, not just Romanian people, all of us in the West, unworthy of their intercession. And may the Romanian saints who suffered under communism, under Talmudic Bolshevism, pray for us all in this time of great trials moving forward. So amen, and God bless everybody.